You are now listening to FireWall Chats with the IT-ISAC. Today's guests are James Granger, co-founder and chief operations officer of Layer 8 Technologies, a business intelligence and risk management firm that is focused on insider threat analysis, and Shawn Thompson, CEO and founder of the Insider Threat Management Group, a leading insider threat and risk management service provider. Today, James and Shawn discuss the importance of creating a strong insider threat strategy, the steps to building an effective insider threat program, and what such a program looks like in action.
Shawn and James, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So as you know, the IT-ISAC recently produced an insider threat guide to its members. The two of you were key driving forces behind that guide. And I thank you for all of the work that you did in driving that. And I'm happy to announce today as well that we will be releasing that guide to the public. It will be available on our website. So we thank you both for your work in driving that. And we also encourage our audience to go to the itisac.org to download that guide and take a look at the good work that went in there. So before we begin, I want to say thank you to you both for your efforts with that guide and for the work you've done with that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So to frame the discussion a little bit, insider threat. So what is an insider threat, right? Is this somebody who is a malicious insider who is working for an adversary trying to steal data? Or is this somebody who is a well-intentioned, trustworthy employee who might be a little careless at times? So what is an insider threat?
Yeah, it's the best to frame in terms and compare it to external threats, right? So as how we use the term insider threat is, anyone to whom authorized access is given as an insider, and therefore any threats emanating and produced by those individuals would be deemed insider threats. NPEs or non-person entities, those individuals or even individuals who unknowingly get hacked by an external threat can be included in that definition as well, in terms of responding to the threat and or developing programs. So it's essentially any individual knowingly or unknowingly or wittingly or unwittingly who has authorized access but is posing a threat to the organization.
Yeah, thank you. So an insider threat isn't just someone who's acting purposefully nefariously, right? You're a well-intentioned employee who's trying to do the right thing. It's a little misuse of clicking on a link that they may not, or that they're not supposed to, perhaps, makes them a threat to the organization. So how do we combat this, right? So what's what's kind of a good way to develop a strategy to combat the insider threat?
Yeah, and that's a key point that you just hit on. It's worth emphasizing. The majority of insider threats are otherwise well-intentioned employees. These are not, for the most part, individuals that are intentionally trying to steal information, to sabotage the company. They are often individuals that are simply, either not conforming to policy or they're trying to do a workaround. There are definitely a large portion of the intentional or the insider threats are unintentional. So that's a great point that needs to be emphasized. In terms of the best way to combat this, in our experience, is through the creation of a true insider threat program. Oftentimes, what we see are piecemeal approaches. In my definition, that's not a program, right? Program is in our definition and how we build programs, it's a collection of interconnected components for a common purpose. So for example, a company who simply buys a particular insider threat tool to detect insider threats without any additional supporting components, functions, etc., to us, that really isn't a program. And it's much more, leads to much more of an ad hoc solution, which is, to your question, really not the best way to manage insider threats. So creating a program, holistic program that includes all the necessary functions and capabilities is, in our experience, the best way to manage insider threats.
Yeah, so you hit on something on the tool set, which is really important, and that we'll come back to in a second. But real quick question. So what comes first, the program or the strategy?
So definitely the strategy has to be there, right? I mean, the strategy, I look at the strategy as the headlights for a car. You can certainly try to drive without your headlights on at night, but it's probably not going to work real well. And that's how I kind of look at it. Strategy turns the lights on for you. Strategy is the lights that are turned on. It allows you to have a clear purpose of what you're trying to accomplish, clear goals, objectives, milestones. So having that strategy will certainly not only provide a consensus and a unified understanding of what the program, what the company is trying to accomplish with this program, but it will also obviously lead to a more clearly defined program once you get to that step.
So you need the strategy, then you need the programs, then you need the tools. So what are the components of a good strategy that get you to having a program?
Yeah, so obviously there's no one size fits all, but I can speak to our experience in helping companies. We've been developing programs for companies for the last 7 going on 8 years now. And what's worked well for us, one model is focused on 4 primary goals. The first being awareness. Companies have to understand who they are giving access to. Essentially, knowing your people is part of this awareness goal. Understanding what your insider population looks like, where are they located, what types of access do they have, differences between contractors, employees, partners, vendors, the entirety of your insider ecosystem, if you will, and understanding, who they are, and where they are goes a long way towards providing you that awareness that is needed. A second goal is understanding. And what we refer to here is an understanding of your assets. So, asset management, obviously crown jewels understanding is a big undertaking, certainly for a large company, but it's nearly impossible to effectively manage insider risk without having some understanding of what your critical assets are, what your crown jewels are, what's important to your company. Number 3, building on the awareness and understanding, is having some type of visibility, having some understanding, some way to observe the interaction that your insiders have with those assets. So understanding your people or even your assets is insufficient if you can't understand how those individuals interact with those assets. And last but not least is to develop the insight based on that observation and those interactions to be able to identify insider threat behavior and to develop appropriate responses. So those are a general framework that we use, that we found successful and useful to frame the discussion when you're trying to create that strategy, when you're trying to obtain that buy-in, that consensus building, which is obviously of utmost importance when you're just starting out, to bring in those cross-functional components and stakeholders that are necessary to continue the program forward.
Yeah, Shawn, I think it's tricky. Some of the experiences that we've had is that the insider threat piece gets added on to something, whether it be incident response, human resources, traditional cybersecurity, and it really crosses all of those domains depending on what the footprint of the company is. But from an analytic perspective, it boils down to, what are your use cases, and just like you said, what are the things that we're really trying to protect, and then establishing some predictive models, right? Rather than depending on the incident response model to do active threat intelligence to be able to detect anomalous behavior, whether it be malicious or benign.
And that's really what's difficult with an insider threat or insider risk program. That is the challenge, and you hit on it, James, is that by definition, an insider threat program is cross-functional, right? You have to involve cross-functional entities, components, data protection. You're going to have the CSO, maybe with physical security, HR with personnel security. You're going to have the CISO for your network and cybersecurity. You're going to have a whole range of cross-functional entities / components and stakeholders that need to be involved to properly manage insider threat. And to your point of it oftentimes gets maybe thrown under cybersecurity or some other entity. That's a problem. And what we've seen is that doesn't lend itself to creating those necessary connections and cross-functional collaboration that's required to manage insider threat. For example, if the insider threat team gets thrown under the, buried in the CISO shop, sometimes it lacks the breadth necessary to really manage it appropriately.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's tricky because each one of these platforms have their own methodology and they have their own way of looking at things. If you think of it from a traditional cybersecurity perspective, you're looking at the logs, you're looking at anomalous behavior, you're turning things on and off as they're coming in and out, you're trying to maintain availability for resources. And if you stay in that space, then you might be overlooking some of the other things, which is you have other human beings that can be indicators for you. You have other portions of or pieces of information or use cases, if you will, that you can look at to determine how to properly build a program, and then what your requirements are from an organizational perspective.
Yeah, and one last point on that, and that's one of the mantras that we use is sometimes, a lot of times, unfortunately, the inside threat programs, quote unquote programs, are lacking a program. There's no real program there, right? There's no real collection of interconnected entities and components and functions. As James was talking, oftentimes the insider threat program, quote unquote program, is simply one dimensional. It's in one type of stovepipe, looking at logs. Maybe it's attached to the SOC, and they move forward from that standpoint. But that's really not the proper use and proper terminology and a proper way to build what we're talking about here, which is a full program.
Yeah. So the concept of who's in charge is really important. So does it matter who's in charge as long as there's somebody in charge, or does it matter who's in charge? Or what's the level of leadership that should be held responsibility for these programs?
Yeah, definitely a key factor. So it definitely, someone needs to be in charge. Absolutely. So if a company can at least get to that point, they are probably already rounding second base, I would say. Unfortunately, again, here a lot of companies don't put anyone in charge, and then of course, with no one in charge, then there's really no good governance structure. There's no real efficient program, because if no one's in charge, then there is obviously a lot of inefficiencies that result. So yes, there should be a defined, ideally a defined individual, leadership, someone in an executive role. Some of the common leaders of the programs are either the CISO or the CSO. Sometimes the chief risk officer is designated as the leader of this program. In other scenarios, it's come to a legal entity or maybe even HR. I will say in my experience, HR is probably not the best. I would say if you wanted to rank them, probably the least best organization to lead this program. HR by definition is employee focused, employee centric. They have different roles and responsibilities, right? They're bringing in folks. They're kind of the care and feeding of the company, which is obviously essential and required and very much needed, but it's a little different focus, right? It's a different focus from a risk or a security perspective. So those goals tend to conflict with what is really needed for a good program. Some of the best are, I would say, underneath the chief security officer is probably the best in my experience. They are often in the best position to develop those cross-functional collaborations that are required by nature of their role. They're often uniquely situated to interact with HR, or legal, and the CISO already. So they're often probably the best. A lot of programs are also under the CISO for maybe legacy reasons, since they've kind of owned obviously the network and the technology and even the tools that we'll talk about in a second are often owned by the CISO. So that can work, but I guess there's no right or wrong answer. I guess there's probably good, better, and best. And in my experience, the CSO or CISO are probably the best for that.
Great. So you have the strategy, you have the leadership, right? You have the program. Now you need the tools, right? So James, how do people get an understanding of what tools that they need, right? So we talked about network monitoring, right? Is it enough to set up some software that monitors people's activity on their keyboard, or how do you begin to evaluate what tool sets you need?
That's a great question. It boils down to what the organization looks like and where and how they're, if you're distributed globally, if you're centrally located, if you're managed in the cloud, what does your footprint look like with teleworking? I mean, that's a brand new risk factor that is grown significantly, obviously, over the last year. But an integrated solution of having a security event manager, DLP, and the other platforms that give you indicators. The challenge you run into is that we mentioned, right, is what are your use cases? And if we go back to a traditional analytic model, you might have people looking at false positives to such an extent to where they can't get out of the chaff, right? And just going back to this integrated portion of multiple platforms working together with human intuition and use cases and requirements based on what the most important things to your company are to do the analysis. And we look at it going back to the question of where should it sit? And we've seen very effective programs that sit in the SOC. However, they model a threat intelligence methodology where they're looking at a very proactive, actionable measures to mitigate risks and threats from every perspective, whether it be traditional cyber or human behavior. And or the other side, right, which is the investigative portion. The challenge you run into there is that once it's an investigation, it becomes very narrow in scope. You're looking to litigate, so you can't necessarily treat that the same way you would for preventative measures.
Yeah. So I guess one of the potential solutions here too, right, is understanding you have the strategy and you have the program, right? You need a tool sets that kind of map to the program that you have in place, right?
Right. And it's a question of resources at that point. And it goes back to that, where does it sit? Because and many of these companies, they're competing for resources when perhaps just integrating existing resources is probably a better solution.
Yeah. So we're talking about resources, and resources is a huge factor, right? We see this challenge frequently in cybersecurity. Is the scope of the threat is pretty significant, and the resources given to cybersecurity teams is doesn't always match the scale of the threat. Now you add the insider threat program in, and so if you're a small to medium-sized enterprise, what do you do? I mean, do you just give up? What are some cost-effective ways that you can do this without having to hire a team of consultants to come in and build a insider threat program, or to have additional large spends on tools that may not be affordable to you? So, what's a small, medium-sized business specifically with a limited budget, but understanding that the insider threat is important to them? What's the one or two things that they can do to help protect themselves?
Well, I would say an insider threat program is free. So, and you already have the people, if you're a small to medium-sized business, to put it together. It's building that knowledge base and then using the tools that you already have. I mean, if you think about modern information security tools that are in place, like Active Directory and least privilege, and building those out at the same time while having an established program and having policies and procedures in place that address how you deal with these things is step forward from a perspective of, rather than dealing with it once it becomes an incident, right? And all the resources that are involved in incident response and forensics and whatnot.
Yeah, I would add to that, focusing on the use cases is paramount, certainly for any organization who is, maybe just starting out, maybe don't have those resources, as you mentioned. Define what it is what are your care abouts? Are you worried more about workplace violence? Are you worried about data leakage? Are you worried about compliance issues, policy? What is it that is most concerning to you as an organization? Is it your partners, et cetera? Define those use cases, be very specific about those use cases. What are the personas and the events that comprise those use cases? And then, as James described, most organizations have resources at their disposal already. Maybe they're even using O365 with a whole range of issues. Maybe it's some native application that might have some basic security functionality within there. So any organization likely has some degree of resources from a tool perspective. And then obviously aligning that with those use cases, you can then expand the other areas, whether it's beefing up some training or make sure you at least define the components of your program. And that's something that we touched on a little bit, but the importance can't be understated. Is in addition to having some type of strategy to understand where you want to go with the program, but defining what that program looks like is essential. And one of the biggest weaknesses that we found in corporate programs is having a lack of understanding of what that really is. So defining what those are, and then you can continue to build out those capabilities accordingly.
Yeah, and then there's, from a medium to small business perspective, there's some psychology involved in it as well. And I mean, just announcing that you have some form of program is going to affect the employees' behaviors, because they know that there is something in place that is there to mitigate threats associated with insiders, right? Whether it be malicious, negligent, or the physical security aspect. I think just by virtue of having one, right? Obviously, you want to make it as robust as you can and effective while protecting people's privacy, is a step further than just investing in some form of technology and assuming that it's going to mitigate your risks.
Yeah, so I think this is all good, right? So for a small medium-sized business, if you're taking the essential cybersecurity precautions, access controls, you're only giving people access to information that they need to complete their jobs, using things such as two-factor authentication, training employees about phishing emails. So that all helps with the insider threat. So it may not be a comprehensive, full-fledged insider threat program, but you are helping. You do have mitigations in place to address the insider threat nonetheless. So is that a fair comment?
It is. The one thing I would add there, and again, this even for the small, medium-sized businesses, going back to the first goal that I mentioned, the awareness goal, small, medium-sized business, maybe even more so than a large business, need to understand what their insider population looks like, right? It's essential to, you might only have 50 employees, but you need to understand, where are they? How many are working remote? What type of access have you given each of them? Is it VPN? What type of control? So understanding your insider population will drive those discussions. It'll drive the use cases. It'll drive the resources, and it'll drive building out the rest of the program and capabilities that are needed.
Yeah, awesome. James, Shawn, thank you very much for joining us. I know there's a lot more on the topic of insider threat. We'd love to have you back in the future if you're willing to come back. This has been a great conversation, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah. So before we run out, any final thoughts or comments before we run?
I would just say for any organization, don't forget about the program. And what I mean by that is, as we discussed, it's something that you need to think about what you're trying to accomplish as far as a strategy, understand and define what it is that you're trying to build. Maybe it's only 1 or 2 or 3 components to start. And you don't have to add 10 to 12 different components. You don't have to do the full program build right away, of course, but be very clear about what that program looks like, and then be very clear about a governance structure, who's in charge, so people know how their roles, responsibilities, as you build out the capabilities and functions.
Great. Thank you, Shawn. James, any last words from you, sir?
No, I agree with Shawn. I mean, it goes back to what are the resources that you have available? What are you trying to protect? What policies and procedures do you have in place to mitigate those threats while embracing and your company culture and your company values? And how do you keep it positive and proactive within your organization?
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you again to both of you for your time today and for your work with the IT-ISAC and our Insider Threat Special Interest Group, which is the group that we use to talk about these things. It's a very interesting topic, very challenging topic, and we appreciate all of the work that you all did with that effort and all of the work that all of you, the time you spent with us here today. Thank you very much. Appreciate your joining, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of FireWall Chats. To listen to more episodes, visit our website, www.it-isac.org.